Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. There is a particular sound to a European holiday resort at dusk. It's a gentle symphony of competing comforts. The clinking of wine glasses from a nearby terrace, the distant laughter of children having one last splash in the pool before bed, the soft hum of air conditioning units kicking on as the day's heat begins to fade. It's a soundscape engineered for relaxation, for the quiet shedding of real-world anxieties. In the spring of 2007, in the tranquil town of Praia da Luz, on Portugal's Algarve coast, this soundscape was the nightly promise of safety. It was the background music to hundreds of family vacations, a temporary paradise of sun, sand, and security. But on the night of May 3rd, that symphony was shattered by a single, primal cry of absolute horror, a cry that tore through the peaceful evening air and signaled the beginning of a silence that has now lasted for years. The cry came from a mother who had just looked into her children's bedroom to find one of them gone. The bed was empty. The window was open. 3-year-old Madeleine McCann had vanished. What followed was not just a search for a missing child, but the birth of a global obsession, a case that would become a labyrinth of conflicting sightings, controversial forensic science, and heartbreaking uncertainty. It would pit grieving parents against a foreign police force, turn tabloid journalism into a blood sport, and leave a trail of ruined reputations and unanswered questions. The story of Madeleine McCann is one of the most intensely scrutinized cases in modern history, yet at its core, it remains a void, an agonizing question mark. To understand how a child can disappear so completely from a locked room in a safe haven, we must look beyond the headlines and the frantic searches. We have to examine the very structure of the chaos that followed. Today, we dissect the anatomy of an international mystery, a case defined not by what was found, but by what was lost in those first critical hours: evidence, trust, and time. We will explore how a combination of cultural missteps, investigative failures, and unprecedented media pressure created a perfect storm of confusion. A storm from which, even today, there is no clear way out. To understand the night of May 3, 2007, you must first understand the days that preceded it. Kate and Jerry McCann, both successful physicians from Rothley, Leicestershire, had arrived in Praia da Luz on April 28th. They were accompanied by their 3 children, 3-year-old Madeleine and 2-year-old twins Sean and Amelie. They were part of a larger group of friends, all medical professionals with young children, a collective that would later become known to the world as the Tapas 7. The holiday was a much-needed escape, a week of sunshine and relaxation at the Mark Warner Ocean Club, a resort popular with British families. Their apartment, 5A, was on the ground floor. It was a modest 2-bedroom unit with a patio at the front and a key-locked sliding glass door at the back. This rear door led to the pool area, and just beyond that, the Tapas restaurant where the group of friends gathered to eat each evening. The arrangement seemed ideal. The parents could enjoy an adult dinner within earshot of their sleeping children, a distance of roughly 50 meters. They established a routine. During the day, the children were in the resort's kids' club. In the evening, the parents would put their children to bed around 7:30 p.m., then meet for dinner at the Tapas restaurant around 8:30 p.m. Throughout the meal, they would take turns going back to their respective apartments to check on the children. The evening of May 3rd began, just like any other. The McCanns put Madeleine and the twins to bed. Madeleine was wearing pink Eeyore pajamas, a detail that would soon be broadcast around the globe. She slept in the front bedroom with her younger siblings, near the unlocked window. Before leaving, Jerry McCann noted that the shutter to this window was closed, but the glass window itself was open. Around 8:30 p.m., Kate and Jerry joined their friends at the Tapas restaurant. Their table had a partial view of the block containing their apartment. The system of checks, which had worked for the past several nights, commenced. Around 9:05 p.m., Jerry McCann left the table to check on his children. He entered apartment 5A through the unlocked rear patio door. He saw all three of his children sleeping soundly in their beds. He noted that the children's bedroom door was wide open, which he found slightly odd, as they usually left it only ajar. He partially closed it before returning to the restaurant. A short time later, around 9:15 p.m., a friend from the dinner party, Jane Tanner, walked past the McCann's apartment on her way to check on her own child. It was at this moment she saw something that would become one of the most critical and debated pieces of evidence in the entire case. She saw a man walking away from the direction of the McCann's apartment, carrying a small child in his arms. The child was wearing pajamas that she described as being similar in pattern and color to Madeleine's. She didn't see the man's face, but his presence was unsettling enough for her to remember it. At the time, however, she assumed it was simply another holidaymaker taking their sleeping child home. Back at the tapas table, another friend, Matthew Oldfield, offered to do a check on the McCann children when he went to check on his own. He went to the rear of apartment 5A and listened at the bedroom window. He couldn't hear anything, so he didn't enter the room. He simply glanced in, saw the twins in their cots, but did not get a clear view of Madeleine's bed. Believing all was well, he returned to the dinner. The clock ticked towards 10 p.m. It was Kate McCann's turn to do a check. She walked the familiar path back to apartment 5A and entered through the patio door. As she walked toward the children's bedroom, she noticed the door was wide open, just as Jerry had found it earlier. But this time, something else was terrifyingly wrong. The window was also wide open and the shutter was raised. And when she looked at her daughter's bed, it was empty. The twins were still there, sleeping soundly in their cots, but Madeleine was gone. A wave of confusion washed over her, followed by sheer, unadulterated panic. She searched the apartment, her heart pounding in her chest. She ran back to the restaurant, screaming the words that would ignite a global firestorm. Madeleine's gone. Someone's taken her. The idyllic holiday soundscape was replaced by shouts, by the sounds of a frantic, desperate search. The friends and resort staff began combing the grounds, looking under cars, in bushes, in storage closets, their voices calling out Madeleine's name into the dark Portuguese night. But there was no answer. The silence that met their calls was the first indication that this was not a case of a child wandering off. This was something far more sinister. In the space of less than an hour, a place of safety had become a crime scene, and a family's life had been irrevocably shattered. The mystery had begun. In any missing child investigation, the first few hours are colloquially known as the golden hours. This is the period where the trail is freshest, where evidence is most likely to be found, and where the chances of finding the child safe are at their highest. For the golden hours of the Madeleine McCann investigation to be effective, a swift, coordinated, and professional response was paramount. What transpired in Praia da Luz in the hours and days after Kate McCann's scream was, by almost all accounts, the opposite. The initial response was plagued by a catastrophic series of missteps, jurisdictional confusion, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the crime. Failures that would create the informational vacuum in which suspicion and conspiracy would fester for years to come. The first police on the scene were from the local Guarda Nacional. Republicana, or GNR. This is a gendarmerie force responsible for general policing, traffic, and public order. They are not the nation's primary investigative detectives. That role belongs to the Policia Judiciaria, or PJ, Portugal's equivalent of the FBI. The GNR officers arrived, took initial statements, and assisted in the search, but they failed to take the single most crucial step in a potential abduction case. They did not secure the crime scene. Apartment 5A, the last place Madeleine was seen, became a hub of uncontrolled activity. Distraught family, friends, and resort staff moved in and out of the room, potentially contaminating or destroying any forensic evidence the abductor might have left behind. Fingerprints, footprints, fibers, or foreign DNA, all could have been compromised within minutes of the alarm being raised. It took over 90 minutes for the PJ to be formally notified and to dispatch senior detectives to the scene. By the time they arrived from their headquarters in the nearby city of Portimão, the golden hours were rapidly closing. There was another critical failure in the immediate aftermath: the failure to seal the perimeter. Standard procedure for a likely child abduction would involve immediate roadblocks on all routes leading out of the town and alerts issued at border crossings and airports. Praia da Luz is a small coastal town, relatively easy to isolate, yet checks at the Portugal-Spain border, only an hour's drive away, were not implemented for many hours. An abductor would have had ample time to leave the area, the region, and even the country without being stopped. This initial chaos was compounded by a significant cultural and linguistic divide. The McCanns and their friends were highly educated British professionals, accustomed to a certain type of interaction with law enforcement. The Portuguese police, particularly in a small resort town, operated with different methods and a different mindset. The language barrier was immense. Statements were taken through amateur interpreters, leading to potential miscommunications and nuances being lost in translation. The McCanns, articulate and proactive, immediately wanted to launch a public appeal, to get their daughter's face on every television screen. This approach, common in the UK, was viewed with some suspicion by the PJ, who traditionally preferred to conduct their investigations with more discretion and secrecy. This clash of cultures would come to define the early and most critical phase of the investigation. The detectives from the PJ, led by Chief Inspector Goncalo Amaral, initially worked under the theory that Madeleine had likely wandered off and met with an accident, a tragic but not uncommon occurrence. They focused their searches on the immediate vicinity, wells, construction sites, and the nearby beach. The theory of abduction by a stranger was considered, but it was not the primary focus. This initial assumption shaped the entire investigative strategy. If you are looking for a lost child, you search the local area. If you are looking for an abducted child, you seal the borders and hunt for a kidnapper. By not treating it as a probable abduction from the very start, precious time and resources were misdirected. Within 48 hours, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann was no longer a local Portuguese police matter. It had exploded into an international media event of unprecedented scale. The idyllic images of the Algarve coast were now the backdrop for a frantic search, broadcast live into millions of homes. This media glare brought immense public support and resources, but it also placed an unbearable amount of pressure on the local police force, who were simply not equipped to handle a case of this magnitude and profile. Every decision, every delay, every quote was scrutinized by a voracious global press corps that had descended on the small town. The investigation was no longer just happening in Praia da Luz. It was happening on the front pages of newspapers from London to Sydney. The anatomy of this mystery was being shaped and arguably distorted from its very first moments, not by the quiet collection of facts, but by the loud and chaotic reality of a crime scene that was never secured, and a media firestorm that could not be controlled. As the days turned into weeks, the initial search for a lost little girl morphed into a complex, criminal investigation with a growing cast of characters. The Policia Judiciaria, under intense international pressure, began to focus on individuals who were in the vicinity of apartment 5A on the night of May 3rd. The first person to be formally designated a suspect, or targuido in Portuguese law, was a man named Robert Murat. Murat was a British Portuguese property consultant who lived with his mother just 100 yards from the McCann's apartment. He inserted himself into the investigation from the very beginning, offering his services as a translator to both the police and the burgeoning press corps. His eagerness, however, struck some as suspicious. A British journalist noted Murat's omnipresence and alerted the police. The investigation into his background revealed that he bore a passing resemblance to a composite sketch of a man seen near the apartment block around the time of the disappearance. On May 14th, 11 days after Madeleine vanished, police raided his home, seizing computers and other evidence. He was taken in for questioning and officially named in targuido the following day. This status, it's important to clarify, does not mean charged. It means a person is formally considered a suspect, granting them certain legal rights, such as the right to remain silent and have a lawyer present during questioning. For Murat, it meant his life was turned upside down. His face was plastered across newspapers worldwide. Despite exhaustive investigation, police found no evidence linking him to the crime. His phone records provided an alibi, and no forensic evidence was ever found. He was eventually cleared, and he would later win substantial libel damages from several British newspapers for their coverage. The focus on Murat, however, consumed a significant portion of the early investigation. While the police were focused on Murat, investigators from the UK were paying closer attention to the witness statements from the Tapas 7, particularly the sighting by Jane Tanner. Her description of a man carrying a child away from the apartment around 9:15 p.m. was the strongest lead suggesting an abduction. The man she described was around 5 feet 7 inches, with dark hair, wearing light-colored trousers and a dark jacket. This sighting for a long time was considered the key to the entire case. It appeared to provide a timeline and a description of the abductor. However, another sighting from that night, initially overlooked by the Portuguese police, would later gain immense significance. An Irish family, the Smiths, were walking back to their holiday apartment in Praia da Luz at approximately 10 p.m., a time very close to when Kate McCann discovered Madeleine was missing. They saw a man carrying a small child who appeared to be sleeping or unconscious. The man was walking towards the beach, away from the town center. The child was blonde and wearing light-colored pajamas. Martin Smith, the father, described the man as being awkward and uncomfortable carrying the child, as if he wasn't her father. The man was in his late 30s, of average build, with short brown hair. The Smith family reported this sighting to the police the next day, but in the initial chaos, and with the focus on the earlier Tanner sighting, it didn't become a primary line of inquiry for the PJ. The two sightings were difficult to reconcile. They occurred at different times, in different locations, and the descriptions of the men, while having some similarities, were not identical. Jane Tanner's sighting at 9:15 p.m. suggested an abductor who moved quickly and was gone from the area well before the alarm was raised. The Smith sighting, closer to 10 p.m., suggested an abductor still in the vicinity just moments before the search began. For years, the Tanner sighting dominated the public narrative. It was only much later, when British police re-examined the case, that a crucial revelation emerged. Jerry McCann, when walking back from a conversation with another holidaymaker, had passed Jane Tanner at the exact moment she saw the man with the child. It turned out the man she saw was almost certainly Jerry McCann himself, carrying one of his own children back from the resort's night creche. Jane Tanner later accepted this was a strong possibility. With the Tanner sighting largely discredited, the Smith sighting rose in prominence, offering a different timeline and a different description of a potential suspect, a description that would become critically important more than a decade later. The investigation was a moving target, with its central pillar of evidence shifting, collapsing, and being rebuilt, all under the relentless gaze of the world. As the summer of 2007 wore on, the investigation took a dramatic and deeply controversial turn. The Portuguese police, having failed to identify a credible external suspect, began to explore a new and explosive theory, that Madeleine had not been abducted by a stranger, but had died accidentally in apartment 5A, and that her parents, Kate and Jerry McCann, had concealed her death and faked an abduction to cover it up. This shift in focus from an external predator to the victims themselves was a seismic event in the case, one driven by a combination of investigative frustration, cultural clashes, and a piece of highly contentious forensic evidence. The McCanns themselves had become public figures on a scale neither they nor the police could have anticipated. Advised that public awareness was key to finding Madeleine, they had launched a high-profile media campaign. With the help of PR professionals and the backing of wealthy benefactors, Madeleine's face was everywhere. On posters, on television, at sporting events. Jerry McCann acted as the family's composed, articulate spokesman, while Kate's palpable grief was visible in every pained appearance. This proactive approach, however, backfired in Portugal. To the PJ investigators and a segment of the Portuguese public and press, their media engagement seemed unnatural for grieving parents. Their composure was misinterpreted as coldness, their articulate appeals as calculated performance. This cultural disconnect created a fertile ground for suspicion. This suspicion was given a seemingly scientific basis in July 2007, when British police, at the request of the PJ, sent 2 highly specialized sniffer dogs to Praia da Luz. The dogs, Eddie and Kio, were English Springer Spaniels trained to detect 2 very specific things. Eddie was a cadaver dog, trained to detect the unique scent of human decomposition. Kio was a blood dog, trained to detect the scent of human blood, even in minuscule, cleaned UP quantities. What the dogs did in Praia da Luz sent shockwaves through the investigation. Inside apartment 5A, Eddie, the cadaver dog, gave an alert behind the sofa in the living room and in the wardrobe of the McCann's bedroom. Kio, the blood dog, gave a positive alert in the same spot behind the sofa. This suggested that a dead body had been in the apartment, and that a spot of blood had been there as well. The dogs were then taken to a car park where various vehicles associated with the case were held. They gave alerts on several items belonging to the McCanns, including Kate's clothes, and a pink soft toy, Cuddle Cat, that had been Madeleine's favorite. Most damningly, Both dogs gave strong alerts in the trunk of the silver Renault Scénic that the McCanns had rented 24 days after Madeleine's disappearance. To the Portuguese investigators, this was the smoking gun. The dogs' alerts seemed to confirm their burgeoning theory. Madeleine had died in the apartment. Her body was stored or hidden for a period, and then later transported in the trunk of the rental car to a secret burial site. This narrative explained the lack of a forced entry, the absence of a credible external suspect, and what they perceived as the parents' strange demeanor. Forensic swabs were taken from all the locations where the dogs had alerted, including the trunk of the car, and sent to the highly respected Forensic Science Service, FSS, in Birmingham, England, for DNA analysis. The results that came back were complex and, ultimately, ambiguous. The FSS used a cutting-edge technique called low copy number, LCN DNA analysis, which can generate a DNA profile from as few as 1 or 2 cells. From the sample taken from the car's trunk, the FSS found a partial DNA profile. The report stated that it contained 15 out of 19 of Madeleine McCann's DNA markers. However, the sample was too small and too complex. It contained DNA from multiple individuals to be considered a definitive match. The FSS laboratory director was clear. It could be Madeleine's DNA, but the result was too complex for meaningful interpretation. Despite this scientific ambiguity, the Portuguese police felt they had enough. On September 7, 2007, 4 months after their daughter vanished, Jerry and then Kate McCann were brought in for questioning and formally declared *Arguidos*. Reports leaked that the police had offered Kate a plea deal, a reduced sentence if she confessed to accidentally killing Madeleine and covering it up. The McCanns vehemently denied everything. 2 days later, they flew back to the United Kingdom, their status as grieving parents now officially eclipsed by their status as suspects in the eyes of the Portuguese law. The story was no longer just about a missing girl. It was now about the parents accused of being responsible for her disappearance. The case had fractured into 2 competing narratives, the one of abduction by a stranger, and the one of a tragic accident and a terrible lie. The declaration of Kate and Jerry McCann as *Arguidos* marked the peak of the Portuguese investigation and, paradoxically, the beginning of its collapse. The case against them was entirely circumstantial, built on the contested dog alerts and the inconclusive DNA evidence. Public opinion was sharply divided. Many were convinced of their guilt, fueled by hostile media coverage that dissected every photograph and public statement for signs of deception. Many others saw them as victims of a terrible tragedy who were now being persecuted by a foreign and incompetent police force. The McCanns, back in the UK, hired a formidable legal team and continued their public campaign to find their daughter, now also fighting to clear their own names. In July 2008, after 14 months of investigation, the Portuguese Attorney General announced a significant decision. The case was being shelved. The evidence against the McCanns was deemed insufficient to proceed to trial. Their *Arguido* status, along with Robert Murat's, was officially lifted. The investigation had reached a dead end. Chief Inspector Goncalo Amaral was removed from the case after publishing a book, The Truth of the Lie, which detailed his theory of the McCanns' involvement. The book became a bestseller in Portugal, but resulted in a lengthy and bitter libel battle with the McCann family. For several years, the official investigation into what happened to Madeleine McCann went cold. But the McCanns refused to give up. They lobbied the British government relentlessly, arguing that since their daughter was a British citizen, the UK had a responsibility to actively investigate her disappearance. In 2011, their persistence paid off. Prime Minister David Cameron, responding to a direct appeal from Kate McCann, ordered London's Metropolitan Police, also known as Scotland Yard, to conduct a formal review of the entire case. This review was codenamed Operation Grange. The Operation Grange team, comprised of dozens of seasoned detectives, started from scratch. They reread all 40,000 documents generated by the Portuguese police and private investigators. They re-interviewed witnesses and re-examined every piece of evidence. Their approach was methodical and free from the pressures and cultural biases that had hampered the initial inquiry, and in doing so, they began to piece together a very different picture of what likely happened on the night of May 3, 2007. One of the first things Operation Grange did was to re-evaluate the two key sightings. As we discussed, they effectively discredited the Jane Tanner sighting, concluding it was a tragic misidentification of Jerry McCann himself. This shifted the entire focus onto the Smith sighting, the Irish family who saw a man carrying a child towards the beach around 10 p.m. The Grange detectives considered this the most credible and important sighting of the entire case. They released new, more detailed EFIT images of the man Martin Smith described. He was not a monster in the shadows, but an ordinary-looking man walking through the streets of Praia da Luz. The team also conducted a thorough review of local crime patterns and known sex offenders who were operating in the Algarve region at the time. They discovered a disturbing history of burglaries in Praia da Luz, often committed while occupants were asleep inside. They theorized that Madeleine's disappearance may have been a burglary gone wrong, an intruder entering apartment 5A to steal, only to find a child who perhaps woke up and then panicked, abducting her to silence her. This theory aligned with the fact that the McCanns had left their rear patio door unlocked. For years, Operation Grange worked diligently behind the scenes, sifting through phone records, cross-referencing suspects, and chasing down thousands of leads. The case remained in the public eye, but the investigation was now a quiet, painstaking police procedural. Then, in June 2020, 13 years after Madeleine disappeared, came the most significant breakthrough since 2007. German police, working in conjunction with Operation Grange, announced that they had identified a new prime suspect. His name was Christian Bruckner. The announcement sent a new shockwave around the world. Christian Bruckner was a German national, a drifter and convicted sex offender with a history of crimes against children. Crucially, in 2007, he had been living in the Algarve, just a few miles from Praia da Luz. He was known to have lived a transient lifestyle out of a camper van, and he supported himself through odd jobs, drug dealing, and burglaries of the very type that Operation Grange had identified as a potential precursor to the abduction. The evidence against Bruckner was circumstantial, but compelling. First, there was the phone data. Mobile phone records showed that on the night of May 3rd, Bruckner received a 30-minute phone call. The call was routed through a cell tower in Praia da Luz, placing his phone in the immediate vicinity of the Ocean Club Resort between 7:32 p.m. and 8:02 p.m., just before Madeleine was put to bed. The call ended, and his phone became unaccounted for during the window of the abduction. This placed him at the scene at a critical time. Second, there was his criminal history and lifestyle. He had multiple convictions for sexual offenses, including the abuse of a child in Germany and the rape of a 72-year-old American woman in her Algarve home in 2005, a crime for which he is now serving a prison sentence. His pattern of behavior fit the profile of a predatory offender. Third, and perhaps most chillingly, was an alleged confession. A former friend of Bruckner's came forward to tell German police that Bruckner had once shown him a self-made video of him raping the elderly American woman. The friend also claimed that during a conversation about the missing Madeleine McCann in 2014, Bruckner had made a deeply incriminating comment, something to the effect of, "She didn't scream." German prosecutors have stated publicly that they are operating on the assumption that Madeleine McCann is dead and that Christian Bruckner is their suspect. They have conducted extensive searches of areas in Germany and Portugal linked to him, digging up gardens and searching wells, looking for any trace of Madeleine. To date, however, they have not found her body or any definitive forensic evidence linking Bruckner directly to apartment 5A. He has not been charged in relation to the McCann case, and he denies any involvement. The investigation is ongoing, a slow and methodical process of building a case that, after so many years and so many false starts, must be airtight. The focus of the world's most famous missing person case has now shifted from a resort in Portugal to a prison cell in Germany, and to a man who, for over a decade, lived completely under the radar. The case of Madeleine McCann remains officially unsolved. There has been no body found, no confession, and no definitive forensic link to any suspect. Christian Bruckner is the prime and, in the eyes of German and British police, the only suspect. But the case against him, while strong, remains circumstantial. The investigation continues, a painstaking international effort to find the final piece of a puzzle that has been scattered across 3 countries and nearly 2 decades. Kate and Jerry McCann continue to wait, suspended in a state of ambiguous loss, unable to grieve and unable to hope. Every year on Madeleine's birthday and on the anniversary of her disappearance, they release a statement, keeping her memory alive, still clinging to the possibility that they might one day have an answer. The fund they established, initially to finance a private search, now primarily exists to support other families of missing people. When we circle back to the central theme of this episode, the anatomy of an international mystery, we can see that the enduring nature of this case is not the result of a single brilliant act by a criminal mastermind. Rather, it is the product of a cascade of failures and unfortunate collisions. It is the anatomy of a perfect storm. The mystery was born in the unsecuritized crime scene of apartment 5A, where crucial forensic evidence was likely lost forever. It was nurtured by the jurisdictional and cultural clashes between a grieving British family and a beleaguered Portuguese police force, leading to mistrust and misinterpretation on both sides. The mystery was then amplified into a global phenomenon by an unprecedented media frenzy, which created immense pressure, distorted narratives, and turned the parents from victims into suspects in the court of public opinion. It was further complicated by the limits of science, where cutting-edge DNA and scent dog evidence proved to be tantalizingly suggestive, but ultimately inconclusive, creating more questions than answers. Finally, the mystery has been prolonged by the very nature of the crime, an abduction so swift and so silent that it left behind almost no witnesses and no trail to follow, allowing the perpetrator to melt back into the transient population of a busy tourist region. The search for Madeleine McCann became more than just a search for one child. It became a mirror reflecting our deepest parental fears, our fascination with true crime, and the complex, often fraught relationship between justice, media, and public perception. It is a cautionary tale about how, in the absence of hard facts, we rush to fill the void with speculation, suspicion, and accusation. The story of Madeleine McCann is ultimately a study in absence. It is a portrait defined not by what is there, but by the devastating, silent, and unending negative space she left behind. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.